I'm Glenn Wood.
And I'm Richard Tadamir.
We're psychotherapists based out of British Columbia, Canada, and you're listening to Deliberating Practice.
In this podcast, we deconstruct everything from the foundations of therapy to its newest innovations and horizons.
We take a critical perspective on contemporary issues that affect therapists across the world. We share our own stories, both personal and professional, and sometimes we talk to other therapists too.
We hope that this podcast can be like sitting with the trusted mentor you always wish you had, helping you integrate and make sense of our complex and exciting field.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. For resources, show notes, and to work with Richard or Glenn for supervision, consulting, or counseling, go to deliberatingpractice.com. Richard, welcome back for episode 3 of our podcast. It's good to be here with you.
Always good to see you too.
Richard, we've got a really interesting episode planned tonight. We're going to be talking about the kind of broad and exciting topic of psychotherapy integration. As you and probably some of our listeners know, there's this idea of integration that floats around in the world of psychotherapy, of practicing from more than one orientation, of bringing multiple perspectives, diverse perspectives into psychotherapy together. And we're going to be looking at how to do that, or the challenges in doing that, the pitfalls in doing that, the problems around this topic tonight.
Excited to do it. We guarantee that everyone will be integrated by the end of this episode.
There you go. A tall order, but but you know, to that point, we are trying to speak of the value of integration tonight in some ways, and also the complexity of integration. And I think the unique experience that everyone has to go through in kind of discovering integration within themselves. So we'll be speaking more about the process as we understand it and as we've experienced it as both an experienced and novice counselor psychotherapist.
So the academic in me would say right away, do we have an operational definition of integration from our perspectives, or do we want to? I'll
take a stab at that. I'm happy to do that. The fact that always kind of bemuses me, you know, or like I kind of laugh about it sometimes, is just this idea that I think someone's counted, and there's been something like 450 different named psychotherapy orientations that have been developed since, you know, psychotherapy's inception, you know, 150 years ago or whatever it was. So there's obviously a great deal of diversity in perspective, diversity in practice, and integration is just the idea that we can inhabit multiple perspectives. We can incorporate or bring together multiple perspectives around the work that we do in a fashion that's cohesive, in a fashion that's comprehensible, and one could argue in a fashion that is maybe more effective than if we were to practice from a singular perspective in psychotherapy or counseling.
Or, as an old supervisor would say to me, eclecticism can be very similar to shooting a shotgun into a forest. So this idea of just, I'm going to mix this modality over here. I'm going to do an art therapy intervention over here, do a little bit of solution focused questions over here. I don't know, stand on my head for 2 minutes. I'm exaggerating, but there's, I think eclecticism too. There's probably an argument for that being able to be done well. But yeah, I think you and our hope is to go beyond that into, can we develop a theory of change? Perhaps this is my view of, a theory of change that is true to us, true to our values, is a good fit for our clients, hopefully based in some research, based also in clinical experience and intuition. And as you said, it's cohesive.
I think you just said there takes me back to integration really speaks to the heart of what we do, that it's the kind of continued process of refinement that comes from our earnest and sincere efforts to try to reach people and support them and to understand how what we do makes a difference. So the diversity has, I think, come and arisen quite naturally from the fact that there's a vast number of people that are engaged in our industry and engaged in this work. And each of them, comes to their own conclusions, quite rightfully so. And integration, similarly, I think is a valued concept in that it encourages a process of refinement and reconstruction and a kind of bringing together of that in the interest of being ever more effective and helpful.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that too.
I think one thing we ought to reference too is part of the logic of integration comes from the research, I think from the 90s, and the kind of concept of the dodo bird effect in psychotherapy. That really there's been some solid research that has demonstrated that no one psychotherapy modality is really consistently more effective than any other psychotherapy, at least when, kind of taken at a meta-analytic level and across the measures that were used in this study. And I think there's some merit in that, to kind of understand that not everyone is suited to a particular type of psychotherapy experience, and not every problem is amenable to the kind of solutions that different psychotherapies might leverage at it. But part of the logic of integration then kind of stems from this place that because one psychotherapy kind of doesn't stand out amongst the bunch as the best, that maybe there's a case to be made that multiple perspectives ought to be brought together, that we need to be more dynamic and flexible in our thinking and our approach to working with patients or clients, recognizing that our ability to kind of take a different perspective can be helpful, that we need to try to meet the client in their unique experience and kind of tailor make the psychotherapy experience for them. And so I think that's a helpful and meaningful perspective. I can certainly, just speaking from my own experience, even in my novicehood, see the value in that and understand, I've met lots of people since I've started this, and not everyone has been amenable to the same type of experience. I certainly have found myself kind of working to shift and adjust myself as necessary to try to meet people in where they're at.
Good therapists do that. And I like what you said here. Psychotherapists and psychotherapy should fit their approach to their clients and not the other way around.
Yeah. I think you and I can both appreciate the challenges that come when we try to ask someone to adjust themselves to our intervention or our perspective on their experience, as opposed to vice versa.
If they stay in the room long enough.
And so there's some perspectives, there's a general set of understandings about how people might go about integrating psychotherapy modalities. These are the kind of common textbook examples. And I understand that there's four kind of main, kind of modes in which you might engage in some type of integration. Richard, the first that you mentioned was technical eclecticism. I think that's worth exploring a little bit more with our listeners. Eclecticism gets a really bad name in integration, even though it's understood as technically as a way of integrating. What is eclecticism? What does it mean to be eclectic versus the, different types of integration? And why would it be a problem, do you think?
Obviously, my supervisor, he took quite a strong view around eclecticism, and his concern, which I would also share with eclecticism, of the idea of essentially from moment to moment, perhaps switching approach, switching interventions. I think there's an idea of intuition there, which intuition can be really good, but I think it also needs to be checked with reason and data and clinical experience, like multiple things, that it can result in this kind of scattershot approach of a little bit of this over here, a little bit of that over there. And I think, we have lots of metaphors further in the show, but if we were to bake a cake, for the first time without any recipe book, it's not likely to turn out very well. Or we take a French school of cooking, we take Chinese style of cooking, we take several different styles, and we don't recognize that they may have very disparate worldviews, different values, different underlying techniques, underlying foundations we need to get to know really well, that we end up making something that tastes like crap. It's not very effective. It might be hard to defend to the client, defend to supervisors, other clinicians. This is a little bit of what my off-the-cuff thoughts are about it.
I think you're speaking to it really well. I like your cooking metaphor. Eclecticism is a good example, and just that it illustrates one of the essential components of good integration, which is understanding that psychotherapies each have their own kind of foundation. Just like, you referenced with like cooking, different schools of cooking will have different basic assumptions. They'll use a basic suite of spices. They'll have a basic cooking process that they tend to gravitate towards. And this can create one of the problems in integration, which is incommensurability. Some things can't really be put together. And so practicing in an eclectic manner runs into that problem of sometimes trying to fit together disparate and incommensurate things that can't really go together and maybe shouldn't go together.
For example, worldview, like in behaviorism, potentially of like, first wave. Pure behaviorism might be that it's, stimuli, reaction, the brain is a black box. People are just products of, their reaction to stimuli. Free choice is an illusion. All of these pieces versus a existential view, right? Of humans have meaning, choice is critical. Not that meaning is just dropped down to us, but that it's important to make meaning. We naturally do this as part of our survival. It actually can serve a function in multiple ways. So trying to mix those two. Now there's third wave behaviorism and things like that could be mixed a little bit more. There's more compatibility, understanding of, that we're not just an amoeba that gets poked and then we move. But yeah, there's an example of some very disparate worldviews that might be hard to go try to use as in the old days, like a punishment kind of a technique or even just like reinforcement system, reward system, without really understanding what motivates this person. Like, what does this fit their set of values? And I think often, because I do understand behaviorism very well and I do use it, and, in common factors, which we'll talk about more, it's something, behavioral principles could be called different things and we're all using it to some degree, but there is, without understanding what the client believes, their worldview, their motivation. This is why maybe a lot of techniques fail. And then what ends up happening? We end up blaming ourselves. Maybe we are partially to blame. We blame the client. We blame something, and nobody's getting a lot better. So
just to trying to imagine an existential behaviorism, or behavioral existentialism, it's boggling my mind.
Oh, I can help you with this. There's definitely, I think we don't use, right, the word behavioral, but think about how much action is involved often in existential therapy. The idea of taking action, the idea of facing our fears. So we can call it, you could call something like a behavioral, behavioral homework.
Yeah.
Sure, extinction. A good example would be, like exposure therapy. There is an argument that existential techniques, though they absolutely have a deep, you have to go and look at its deep value base and all of those things. It's not just purely saying, okay, do this thing. It's not exactly like exposure, but on the surface, it may look very similar to a behavioral technique of facing one's fear about a jet and their fears of death. You could absolutely carry out something that's similar, but existential would actually look at, our meaning. It would look more at our history. It would look at, there's a very rich basis of philosophy. So
I like it.
Yeah,
I think
an example.
I think despite your eloquence and capacity for integration, Richard, of these two very disparate positions, that it's a good example too of the kind of eclectic, kind of mixture that wouldn't quite make sense. That in a lot of cases, behaviorist perspective and an existentialist perspective wouldn't go together. And so using techniques or positioning oneself between or within those positions, kind of back and forth, can bring about an effective process.
Eclecticism and integration are often, however you want to define it, are often done really poorly and without understanding what it is.
Is the word that I like to use.
Yeah, I like that.
There's another mode of integration which I'm a big fan of. I think this is the often recommended mode, although there's two others which we'll also talk about, which I think also have really good, like really strong merits from their position. But assimilative integration. So assimilative integration is a mode of integration where you take a single modality as your root modality, the position or the stance from which you practice generally, and then you bring in perspectives or techniques from other modalities that are consistent with that root modality. So I think a very common example of this, one that we would see generally amongst our fellows, kind of how I understand myself in many respects, and how a lot of my colleagues and friends understand themselves too, is a kind of root of like a person-centered root, a person-centered stance.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like a framework.
Yeah.
Where,
paradigm. I'm basically approaching the client from the perspective that I'm going to try to hold their experience. I'm going to engage reflectively with them, and I'm going to engage in a kind of validating, acceptant, congruent manner with them, in an effort to create conditions where growth, change, self-discovery are possible, right? And then within that, I bring perspectives that are valuable. So I can integrate an existential perspective into that. I could see, for instance, some of the experiences that people bring to the therapy room as stemming from conflicts between the kind of basic conditions of one's existence and one's defenses against those conditions. I can integrate some psychodynamic theory. I can see people as, inhabiting a multiplicity, as being driven by forces, as experiencing defense, against their own experience as a process of adaptation. Yeah, and then I can engage with patients in a kind of experiential frame. I can ask them to try things in the room, understanding that this is valuable to them. So I think that this is a very common mode of integration, one that is frequently adopted by people, whether they understand it or not. I think tacitly, more often than not. But I would say the value of this over in technical eclecticism is that you have a basic foundation that you stand within. And then you incorporate only techniques or perspectives or positions into your practice that are consistent with those basic values. So there is a kind of coherence built into this. I think that coherence helps. It helps us, because it helps us stay rooted and grounded in what's important. And it helps the client that we work with, because what they are experiencing has a kind of consistency to it, which I think structures the therapy process, supports containment, allows process and forward movement. And then there's another mode of integration, which I think is a little bit different than the others. This one is called theoretical integration. And what it's referring to here is where you take two theories, two distinct modalities or more, you can incorporate more, and you work towards an integration at a theoretical level to create a kind of new psychotherapy approach out of this. So your existential behaviorism example might have been an example of theoretical integration. Another example, the one I like to reference in this regard, is emotion-focused therapy. Maybe a lot of people don't know, maybe our listeners don't know. Emotion-focused therapy is a good example of a theoretically integrated modality. Sue Johnson, Les Greenberg have done a lovely job of integrating a person-centered, psychodynamic, attachment theory, experiential and existential perspectives and positioning into its own unique brand, its own unique stance that is not really dissimilar to any of these, but also has its own focus.
And I think when we say theory too, theory brings it to mind that we have a hypothesis. There's a theory of change and it's specific. So in a sense of like EFT coming out of work originally, if we look at really early, even before it was called EFT, her work with Sue Johnson's work in children that had difficulty attaching, adoptive homes, etc., like this. So understanding attachment really well. So there's a population, there is a idea of how this population could, well, there's issues that they're facing, let's say difficulty with attachment, difficulty with relationship, an avoidant kind of attachment strategy. Right? So population issue. And then there is a theory of change as well. So that if we try this would be proposed to maybe increase attachment, let's say, increase the likelihood of secure attachment. Therefore, a change would happen. So very much thinking kind of like, having those kind of factors or conditions, I think, are necessary to a theory. If you have like a very wide assumption, this will work for everyone. No, it's designed for a specific purpose with a specific population with under some specific conditions.
That's a really good point, Richard. And that makes sense that these integrated theories that we understand are derived from expert practitioners looking at a problem, looking at a specific type of experience that people often carry, and going, okay, well, this position doesn't quite have what I need, but if I bring in something from this, it's helpful. Or maybe I just need to revise completely the perspective on this particular issue and reconstruct my own unique theory around it that draws from multiple disciplines. Yeah. I think another...
And it can come from the data too. It can come from seeing how do, let's say, with foster parents, what are the foster parents who are the ones that are effective and the foster children maybe are saying, okay, these I have a really great attachment with, they're doing better in school. So whatever way we wanted to do research on their effectiveness, and then looking at those factors that the foster children, the foster parents, the researchers seem to be improving those particular things. So data can also lead us to,
right.
to a theory.
Just, we've seen this. This is a kind of established fact that we recognize now. This leads us to maybe conclude that this is actually going to be the most effective thing. And so how do we go back to the theory table with this then and revise our understanding to incorporate this fact? Yeah. I really see theoretical integration as a natural progression of the meta-theoretical process of developing psychotherapy theory. That there's people in the field that are working towards trying to be more and more effective, and that are in positions at research institutions, practice institutions, where they have the support and the time and the resources to really develop and refine a process. Yeah. Another example that comes to mind for me immediately is just DBT. I think, this is another great example of just Marsha Linehan, like really sitting down and trying to reason out the problem of how do I help this specific type of population? Yeah. And okay, some of this works, but I need to draw concepts from sometimes, even completely outside of established psychotherapy perspectives and bring in these techniques. Yeah. And so I think many people practice from a theoretically or, integrated fashion as well. People who are practicing a lot of these contemporary therapies are engaging with clients integratively. But Richard, there's a fourth mode of integration, and this is really your baby. I'm really curious. It's common factors, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on common factors, what they are, and how that's also a mode of integration.
Sure. I'm newer to common factors myself. It's something that I was only touched on a little bit in grad school, but my own PhD supervisor is very strong in it, talks a lot about transdiagnostic mechanisms, and essentially this idea of across theories, there's some similar things we might call, for example, again, I'll use the existential behavior, something like a exposure. So we're calling this technique where we're having a client face their thing they're anxious about, let's say clowns. So they're looking at a picture of clowns, then they have a progression of staying in that fearful kind of stimuli. And you could do something in another therapy, in existentialism, doing something called like a paradoxical technique where I really don't want to face this thing. I'm very scared of it. The therapist brilliantly puts together, perhaps a paradoxical technique where, again, in essence, they are facing something that they're scared about, right? Maybe they are, they're feeling very paralyzed at home, and I don't know. There's different ways of doing this. Also in EFT, enactment, this idea that I'm going to I have to face my emotions, right? I have to face the underlying emotions and vulnerabilities that are happening. So in any case, there's several different common factors that we love, I think, in our own schools of therapy to trademark as, oh, this is something so unique that we're doing, but actually we're hitting upon some very essential common factors of, we might call, bringing something to somebody's awareness, making the unconscious conscious, like consciousness raising. We can see that in a number of different theories, right? Again, the example of exposure, we could call this some type of, if we wanted to use a trans-theoretical language, some type of enactment or action, that the client is taking. So common factors is looking at what is common across these therapies and realizing that maybe we're not so different after all. Is it important to understand where maybe this, again, if we are using a particular theory or technique, what common factor are we likely hitting on when we're using that, and making sure that we're not putting it into an area where it isn't, or maybe identifying, actually that is something that is more unique, or the nuance really matters. But that gives us the freedom, and Wampold talks a lot about that, and that's where the dodo bird effect comes up, of this idea that because the things that seem to be causing change in a client, ultimately we call them by different names, but we're essentially doing the same kind of thing. And also going from that, this idea of, well, okay, if we're going to really condense what therapy is about, like what causes change. And I really like this idea of this contextual model. Walpole called it in 2015, How Important Are the Common Factors in Psychotherapy, and Update. He mentions this, and I quote, "The three pathways of the contextual model involve the real relationship, the creation of expectations through explanation of the disorder and the treatment involved, and C, the enactment of health promoting actions. Before these pathways can be activated, an initial therapeutic relationship must be established. The initial meeting of patient and therapist is essentially the meeting of two strangers, with the patient making a determination of whether the therapist is trustworthy, has the necessary expertise, and will take the time and effort to understand both the problem and the context in which the patient and the problem are situated. The formation of the initial bond is a combination of bottom-up and top-down processing. Humans make very rapid determination within 100 milliseconds based on viewing the face of another human or whether the other person is trustworthy or not, suggesting that patients make very rapid judgments about whether they can trust their therapist." So we know what really, even though the technique we use or the therapy might be a small percentage of the influence on change, that the therapist that is using that technique is what really matters. So if we're a therapist that has, and the therapeutic relationship puts that as first and foremost, if we can accept feedback, there's a lot of research from Scott Miller about feedback informed treatment. We can understand, when we're getting in our own way, when we are doing things that are rupturing, what is our ability to repair those ruptures? There are super shrinks in this sense. And Scott Miller writes a lot about this. So yeah, I hope that was somewhat coherent.
No, I think it was great. My mind immediately went to a while ago. I was just looking up different psychotherapy training. There's I think an institute in the United States that teaches people from a Satyrian perspective. Virginia Satir, lovely therapist. But they advertised her model, like they advertised this idea, like Virginia Satir talked about this idea of self, and it had a capital S, and just the way it was advertised in the model, it's like it might as well have had a trademark beside it. And I just thought that was so funny because the idea of sort of a self is really not unique to Virginia Satir. It's really not unique at all to the perspective, to many perspectives in psychotherapy. And that's no shade on Virginia Satir, who I was a gifted and very effective psychotherapist, but just that the people that are marketing this they're talking about it as though this idea of having a self-integration is only a Satyrian thing. Like you said, in Common Factors, there's really only a handful of things that we can do, and there's commonalities amongst all the perspectives in psychotherapy. And so that's another way of managing this diversity and of moving in towards integration, is just to identify what are the things that are consistent, again, coming back to consistency as part of integration, consistent across modalities. And what are the, like outside of any particular theory, what are the things that just work? What is therapy?
Yes. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
That's the essence of it.
That just work, right? that anyone does that are effective.
Yes, not even therapists. And I love how Scott Miller talks about his experience being, a very strict secular scientist and seeing that shaman, seeing that psychics were doing these common factors of consciousness raising, of advanced empathy, of absolutely they had a strong therapeutic alliance. People are coming to them in dire straits. And they are very effective. So this idea that therapists are the only people that are effective, that's not true. But we do want to take an approach of understanding. I think science definitely has something to add, a scientific and a critical perspective of who are those. I think there's therapists out there that are shams. They are really not helping clients. And we know that there's psychics that are, and vice versa. So knowing what are those things that actually promote change needs to be, as I said before too, the paradigm can't just be our paradigm, to go back to Walpole, that we have this framework for helping the client understand what struggles that they're facing. It needs to be consistent too with their worldview. And this is one of the reasons why therapists that are quite similar in their life experience and can use similar metaphors and frames of experience often tend to do better with their clients.
Yeah. I mean, you said makes a lot of sense. what we do is not really unique to us. We're just more practiced in it. I think to be helpful is universal. Anyone can access that. Just jumping back a little bit and just riffing more off the concept of common factors. I'm just thinking about how in my graduate degree I watched a lot of videos of psychotherapy. I had a lot of therapists I really admired, and in some sense, watching them, all of them are similar. They're all unique a little bit in what they do, but they all kind of really do a lot of the same things. They're all trying to get to the same place too, I think. They maybe just take a bit of a different route there. And I think that that's inherent to this as well, right? Like you referenced, there's really maybe only, 3 or 4 different conditions that are ultimately therapeutic, that ultimately promote or bring about healing, change, transformation, like we talk about. Many ways to get there, but really only a few things that actually provide the healing transformation that people are hoping to experience. So that says something about this world of integration as well, and certainly lends credit to the common factors perspective. Well, and so now that we've charted the territory of the world of integration, maybe we can talk about the problems with it, because I think that's partly what prompted this episode, was just how flippin' hard integration is. And I think for both of us, an experience of big discrepancy between this kind of, hey, integration, it's important, our professors and supervisors advocating for integration, but discrepancy between that and the fact that there's actually not been a lot of support or kind of concrete experiential support to actually engage in integration. That integration has kind of been this nebulous thing.
Yeah. Right? I think it's interesting. We have, this is pretty similar to lots of graduate schools. There's an expectation kind of in the first semester of practicum that people are certainly using humanistic and a client-centered techniques, basic counseling skills, micro skills, right? Empathy, reflection, et cetera, and then maybe beginning to dip their toes by the end of that first semester into some other theories. But by semester 2, we're hoping that trainees would be using interventions from other than humanistic, from a variety of different modalities, and that they understand what a good intervention is with a particular population at a particular time, and have developed a theory of change that's integrated to them. But so we have these expectations, but I think it can really vary about how much of that is achieved by the end of grad school. And then after the end of the grad school, a lot of trainees, because I have quite a few trainees that I can mentor after they're done graduate school, they can feel like, and I know I felt similar too, is okay, you're now a practitioner, you're responsible, you're a CCC, RCC, whatever. And okay, good luck. We can feel like we're dropping off cliff is what I think I experienced to some degree. I did really good at, beg, borrowing and stealing any mentorship that I could, but it was hard. It's certainly not the same supports as grad school. Not that we can really expect that in the real world to be as structured, and neither maybe it should. We need to take the training wheels off a bit. But still, even in grad school, we have these expectations now, you should be doing advanced techniques from this theory, you should be integrated or at least, have a pathway of integration. And it's hard. I don't know how many practitioners achieve that. They do it well enough to pass a comprehensive exam or a thesis, but there's also this sense of not only, okay, did we practice just, again, we really like EFT and we like this, we want to work with couples, and we also, I don't know, like AADP and its frame of attachment and trauma, and going deep into complex trauma processing. And great. So that works for, we could see that being helpful, let's say, for traumatized couples. But does this actually fit your values? Does this fit your life experience? I'm talking about as the therapist, right? Things that I think, and we were hitting on this in a previous episode, is our clients can tell in their nervous system, this nervous system synchrony of whether resonance, right? It's often called, of whether we've actually gone through something similar. We've gone through some pain, gone through some suffering, and we understand what that's like in a felt sense. And are able to regulate our nervous system and kind of been through suffering and kind of got to the other side. Not that, we can ever fully escape that. But if that makes a little bit of sense. So this felt sense, this values for ourself, our integrating our life experience, us as the person, the self as therapist, that is really
for
missing,
sure.
I see.
That's its own, I think we're going to touch on that a little bit later, its own topic of the kind of integration of the life world, a de-emphasizing theory so much, and kind of just being yourself and the importance of self-development as part of being a good therapist, which is absolutely 100% the case. And I think too, what you just spoke to, really important, just that learning any psychotherapy modality, it can takes time, practice, lots of effort and support. It's not easy, let alone learning multiple perspectives at the same time and learning to integrate them all at the same time. I think it's a lot to ask students to be able to do this in a single 150-hour practicum, right? And certainly I felt like when I left my practicum, about the only thing I understood was that this was a problem that I was going to have to figure out, that I knew that integration was complex, but I didn't necessarily feel that I had mastered it.
And we're kind of expected to do it on our own, which is my problem. I think integration is a relational experience. It should be, even if we're looking at practices that are really about what it means to be human. This idea of there's the Buddhist monk, the meditation teacher, and the student, but we can also have things to learn. I learned so much from my supervisees. I hope they learn something from me. That there is a co-teaching, a co-authoring. It's relational. This idea that we can just integrate on our own. Honestly, I think people do have this kind of idea, or that's, what they're left with, because maybe it certainly isn't easy to find quality supervision. Sometimes, even peer supervision, right? We get so alone in our practice and the everyday problems of our clients.
Yeah. I mean, there's value in studying, I think, at least. I think that there's tremendous value in reading. I think it's very important that,
absolutely,
as a counselor, psychotherapist, that you spend time with the research literature and also just with books, books on the topic of psychotherapy. And there's so many. We've talked about the value of looking at psychotherapy as an art and paralleling it with martial arts.
I loved your metaphor.
This is one way that I tried to make sense of the process of integration during my learning experience, because again, there was a lot of complexity to it for me. I keep coming back to one of the biggest problems in integration being incommensurability. I referenced this earlier in the episode, that certain things just don't fit together in psychotherapies. And this is what brought me to this kind of parallel image of imagining martial arts, because in martial arts, there are different martial arts that are fundamentally distinct from each other and don't lend themselves to integration. And so I really like thinking about the idea of, like, in martial arts, one of the most basic things that you learn first in any martial art is the stance. Every martial art has its own unique way that you stand, way that you hold yourself. And this is, I think, a good way of talking about the kind of basic foundational assumptions that come with different kind of theories of psychotherapy. Psychotherapists also stand, and they have kind of stances. And if you're not standing right, it doesn't matter if you're using a move from, a particular psychotherapy. If you're not standing right, it's not going to land right. It's not going to hit right.
Very good point.
You could imagine, for instance, if you're learning Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but you're standing at a karate stance, it's not going to come out right. It's not going to be done. So we have to start at this level of foundation. And so it was helpful to think about that, because I think that at a basic level, like you referenced in students' learning experiences, there's this kind of expectation towards integration. For a lot of students, it ends up being haphazard eclecticism, because that's just all they can do in the time that they have. And if there isn't a conscious sense of teaching students how to stand first, if there isn't a thorough process of instruction that supports healthy integration, then they're just going to pick a move here, pick a move there, pick a move, whatever that they like, and not appreciate that, there could be something more fundamental that needs to be practiced first, that then lends itself to certain type of moves.
Absolutely. I love how you've put that.
The idea of stance is, like one of the perspectives that I practice from, that you practice from, the existential perspective. There's this idea that the existential perspective is only a stance, that there isn't really a technique that comes from, that kind of comes from existential psychotherapy. Existential psychotherapy is not a singular thing. And it's not really a corpus of techniques. It's really just a way that you position yourself in relationship to your clients, and a kind of basic way that you understand how you might be helpful, and so I like that too. I think that this perspective on stance is very important for me in that sense, because I was so drawn to that. And then there was the sense of, okay, well, why am I not doing anything else then? Why am I not kind of throwing these punches that, I'm being told to throw? Oh, it's a
So you got the stance down, but you get walloped.
But it's because, in that stance, there's a certain type of move that feels natural and important, but then there's a certain type of move that doesn't.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And so I think that's an important parallel. And then, you can also see, like, I think it's just helpful to think about it from that perspective too, because it's so concrete. You can see, for instance, how mixed martial arts has been a more popular sport nowadays. That's a nice way that people have integrated martial arts. There's a parallel though too. We can also be like mixed martial artists and develop a broad skill set. We can grapple, we can punch, we can kick, we can be effective in many different spaces in the arena.
And mixed martial arts, I could see it in knowing a little bit about it, because I read Tim Ferriss's, I can't remember but one of his books talking about learning everything from mixed martial arts to cooking, in the most rapid way possible. And it has kind of this idea of like, okay, well, what is our goal here? So if our goal is to pin the opponent, if that is what our goal is, there's ways of doing that as quickly as possible. So it's not always maybe the most beautiful and like elegant, but there is a technical chess that's happening really rapidly. So a theory is coming. And so there's a theoretical kind of integration that's happening there of, well, my hypothesis is this move seen in over so many fights seems to be what leads to a pin, or moving the arm in this way physically cannot move any farther. Therefore, the person has to submit.
Just consistent with that, I think, Bruce Lee is a good example of a really great
the master therapist, Bruce Lee.
A very pragmatic martial artist who he's famous for that quote: take only what is effective, reject what is ineffective.
That'll be our homework for all the listeners, is to watch.
There you go. His stance, which I think is a good stance for psychotherapists to take as well, was to be flexible, in his understanding of his art, was to be flexible in himself and his practice. And there was value in that. There was value in him adjusting himself to be more and more effective. One of the cases for integration and why it's so important is because of the history of unimodal counseling and psychotherapy and the theory wars that have gone on for so long, and how tempting and easy it is to fall into a singular position on psychotherapy and human suffering, and become myopic in our perspective on what's helpful to people. And I know that this is less the case now because of the efforts towards integration, but I mean, historically, you had people who were solely psychodynamic, solely behavioral, cognitive behavioral, and would never think outside their own paradigm or consider that something else might be helpful to someone.
And I think it's a large, because we saw that the most in the West, and this is, I think it's partly a product of very individualistic, capitalistic marketing mentality, is we're going to position this one thing as superior. This will meet your need. This is the thing that'll work. And then everything else is kind of bullshit. So there is definitely, because we don't see that as much, not that, other cultures don't have wars or, battles of ideology. They certainly do. But I'm thinking about Buddhism, for example, right? Which can allow for, this universality between religions and philosophies.
Buddhism is a lovely example in that it's a religion that is constantly adapting itself to the cultures that it moves into. And you can trace the history of Buddhism through the East, for instance, and see its transformation. It originated in India, which at the time had a strong spiritual culture. Yeah. And there was this established sense of, okay, if you wanted to be someone who devoted yourself to spirituality, you could do that. You could renounce, the kind of day-to-day life and become an ascetic. And this was okay. And people would give you money or give you food every day. And so you could survive and devote yourself to spiritual practices. When Buddhist ideas moved into China, this was not the case. Chinese people worked, Chinese people were industrious, and they needed to, this was part of the culture. And so this is where the idea of a monastic community developed, because, you could get together with other people who were all devoted to spiritual practice, and you could work as a community to sustain yourselves while you engaged in practice. And then, Buddhism's now in the West, and we see, we can't really give up that much of our day-to-day lives here in the West. We're so entrenched in the worlds that we live in. But we can spend a few hours, watching a YouTube video, or we can engage in a weekend retreat or a week-long silent meditation retreat. We can take a vacation from life and be a Buddhist for a little bit. And that's okay. That's consistent as well. That's how Buddhism has showed up in the West. So yeah, a lovely example. And we ought to do the same thing. We ought to be able to adjust ourselves the same way. We also talked about this idea, Richard, or I like to forward the position that there are really only two types of psychotherapy. That despite the fact that there are 450 types of psychotherapy, given what we've talked about integration, about common factors, and about the commonalities amongst many, if not all, of the different perspectives in psychotherapy, that there are really just two dominant schools of thought in psychotherapy, and then their progeny.
Yes, I liked your explanation of the tree. Please
So it's the idea that there's really just therapies that stem from the psychodynamic orientation and therapies that stem from the behavioral perspective, which are two very broad schools of thought in psychology in general. Because psychoanalysis was not just a way of doing psychotherapy. Psychoanalysis is an established mode of thinking about, a theory of psychology, thinking about things psychologically, tries to be a theory that kind of accounts for all human behavior and psychological life. And same with behaviorism. The behaviorists had a similar perspective of, we completely understand how humans work. But it's interesting, you can trace, and this isn't always done. I think one of the flaws in the way that we teach theory nowadays is we don't teach theory historically, or at least there isn't historicity that's emphasized in the way that teach. So it's like, okay, there's this type of therapy, there's this type of therapy, there's this type of therapy, and we don't appreciate the interconnectedness amongst all of them, right? A lot of people don't know that Carl Rogers was heavily influenced by Otto Rank, who was the secretary of Freud. He worked as Freud's secretary, who who moved to America and kind of derived his own, like all of us, derived his own unique perspective on psychotherapy practice. But Carl Rogers was heavily influenced, and he explicitly states Otto Rank was one of his heavy influences. And
an existentialist.
Yeah. And so, great example of how people wouldn't think of Carl Rogers as psychodynamically inclined, but person-centered therapy is a psychodynamic therapy in many respects. It draws heavily from psychodynamic theory. Carl Rogers had a very simple theory of the self. The notion of defense was incorporated into his theory. And we could look at the humanistic movement in general as a reaction to some of the challenges or problems, both in the psychodynamic and in the behavioral positions on psychotherapy.
And in society, too, of fascism, extreme individualism, things like this. So it also, addresses some of these societal ills, I guess. And I think psychodynamic, some other things are that it isn't afraid to look at history. So it's we often talk about the frame that the therapy is in. So it looks at how past influences affect one's current condition, whereas behavioral is very much focused on the present. So how can this behavior be changed so then we get a desired result in the future? So mostly present and a little bit into the future.
Yeah. They differ strongly in how they regard human behavior. I think one of the other points in history that people don't always appreciate is that for a long time, psychodynamic psychotherapy was guarded. It was protected behind the title of psychiatrist. It wasn't something that was accessible. And so, people couldn't just go and practice psychoanalysis, psychodynamic psychotherapy without going through an initiation. But there were people that were still earnestly interested in helping others. And especially after World War II, as you know, and I've referenced before, there was a great need for additional psychological support. And so people that weren't traditionally associated with the world of psychotherapy became so. They stepped into the arena and they brought a different perspective. They brought a behavioral perspective. They brought a contemporary eclectic psychological perspective. And some of these folks were trained in analysis and then deviated. I think, one of the things I always find interesting is I think it's William Glasser, the developer of reality therapy, which is a strongly behaviorally oriented therapy. He was an engineer in training before he became a psychotherapist. So, a lot of these practitioners brought orientations or perspectives from different areas of science, from different industries into the work of psychotherapy. And so, unsurprisingly, their psychotherapies look very different than those rooted in or connected to the psychodynamic family tree. I think there's a case to be made that there's really just these two schools. Yeah,
I could see that.
Yeah.
I could see that.
Lends credence again to the idea of common factors and to the idea that some of this diversity that we're dealing with is false and superfluous.
Yes.
So, Richard, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you, as an experienced practitioner, have made sense of integration over your career. I'm assuming you're not practicing unimodally. You've developed something of an integrative practice over your 10 plus years as a counselor and psychotherapist.
I'd like to think so. Depends on the day. First of all, there's another problem with how we might think about or what we expect for integration is this, and even how we design, I think there's a big problem within even graduate school of we're trying to look at the human change process, which is so dynamic and has so multifactorial. And there's this idea of you get an A in this, or you get we're putting kind of the marks connected to a paper, which can breed a lot of like perfectionism. And this idea that we graduate. Oh, now we're integrated. Fuck no. Integration is a lifelong process. I'd like to think that I'm more integrated spiritually, personally, professionally, theory of counseling wise than 10 years ago. I feel that I am, but it's going to be an ongoing process. So I talk a little bit about this idea of like, we are coming into mastery, the process of coming into mastery in any profession of this beginning in an unconscious incompetence. We don't know what we don't know to all the way to now a conscious incompetence. Well, I know that something should be different. I know that I'm not maybe hitting the mark. I see that there's not the results that I would like in whatever I'm doing, therapy or otherwise, to then an unconscious, all the way to an unconscious competence. This is very natural for me that I can do this. It becomes well practiced and natural and fluid. And I can almost be, and I do have moments of that as a therapist, where I'm in a flow state. I'm not even in a conscious competence. I don't even have to necessarily deeply think and rack my brain about what is the right thing to do in this situation. There's always novel things and challenges, and that's what makes therapy very interesting and will be an awesome career for the rest of my life, hopefully. But yeah, this is a path that we have developing any type of skill. And I do want to point to this idea that sometimes integration can be such an overly cognitive idea. And I don't think that's it's not simply a cognitive process. It's a process of integrating our head, our heart, our gut. There's more and more research about the gut brain. There's research about, even how our heart is connected, certainly obviously to our nervous system, but it has kind of its own wisdom. So understanding that our values, our life experiences, the things that we did not do in therapy school. I love my trainees that have had lots of years of experience as artists, as architects, as maybe in totally other helping professions. And they have so much wisdom to add to, for myself, love to talk with them, the other grad students. And even the other therapists, again, in the agencies that they're doing their practicum and things from, they might be newer to the particular language of therapy, but they're not new to helping humans change or problem solving or mastery of a skill, let's say, or even an art. We have to develop our own theory of change. So that's the point that I'm getting at. I take certainly from existentialism, I take from ideas of like positive psychology and transformation and Maslow and transpersonal psychology. And I also pragmatist as well. So I definitely will use behavioral techniques, but they're from an idea and from assumption that humans are naturally good, that I cannot fix any client. I'm not the one doing the fixing. I'm helping set about just like a good gardener would, putting some fertilizer in, some water in, into the right ratios. I'm creating some conditions for change that would be a good climate for change. And the client has to make some very big decisions. And the people around them too play a factor in that hugely of what change is happening. That's a little bit about me.
I love that, Richard. I love what you said about the need to integrate life experiences, the value in drawing on things outside of the therapy room. And how you described it, I'm almost hearing you more as you're saying, Glenn, I've become personally integrated, like I've become integrated in myself. And that is translated into an integration in my practice.
I love that you captured that. Yeah. Well said. Well, I couldn't say that myself. I love that. I didn't.
You did it
say
implicitly.
It so eloquently.
Yeah.
Unconscious.
That's right.
Competence.
Yeah. But I think you're speaking to the heart of the matter in many respects. More, we're talking about theory integration, but that this is really also about personal psychological integration. That the more integrated you are, the more integrated you practice, and that
down to our nervous system, down to the point of, again, that when I'm facing suffering with a client, that I can be with them in that, but not be overwhelmed by it. And that's a very important trait that I think is both, there's a level of that, innate, and I think it can be nurtured. Absolutely. I think I've improved in that and not take things so personally or connect, my identity about whether a client is getting better or not. So I think that's been a big sign of personal and professional integration. But that's something I look for even in grad students as early as possible. If they faced some suffering in their ability to maintain a window of tolerance around that, not to numb, not dissociate, not anything like that, and not so overly involved that now they don't know where the client starts and they begin.
Yeah, those are things that aren't necessarily explicitly instructed or incorporated into theories, but are really essential. Can you just kind of be with the other person?
Especially when you're doing complex trauma work. I do psychedelic therapy work. I do a lot of family conflict work. These are things that your nervous system is going to get, for lack of a better, assaulted in a lot of ways. There's a lot of stimuli going on. So your ability to be able to stay cool without being detached is very important. Or you could have all of the names of all of the theory that you want. Are you going to be able to effectively practice it? It's like essentially, it might feel to one's nervous system not dissimilar to maybe the military training, where there's a reason why they do military training in the way that they do, is you're crawling under the barbed wire, under a timed speed, and then they're firing blanks. And then in some military training, they're firing live rounds, or you don't know whether it's live rounds or not. You are conditioned for that environment. Okay, I remember at a felt sense of what I need to do when I'm acting as that becomes a new default.
We really do step into war zones, don't we?
So what about you, Glenn? I'd love to hear your experiences.
I think my first sense of it is just that it's hard. My experience with integration it's been really challenging. I've made a point of emphasizing that, if you will, and really opening myself to that. There's a lot of divergent perspectives in psychotherapy out there, and there's a big wide world that we live in. But I think for me, it goes a little bit deeper too. I think for me, I was really impacted by my basic education in psychology. I graduated from my undergrad probably 10 years ago now. And at the time, and it's still the case, and it has been for some time now, there's a really big push towards empirically validated psychotherapy, to a kind of objective frame for looking at psychotherapy. I think we had a single lecture on very basic and poorly explained kind of understanding of psychodynamic therapy. Many contributors got one sentence. We just knew who they were. but nothing about what they had to say. And I had no sense of the richness. And it was really de-emphasized to me. So I walked into my counseling program kind of open to the possibility of learning something new. A lot of instinct that was pointing me to practicing in a way that was dynamic, humanistic, existential. But this other part of me that was very much like, oh no, I need to do this the right way. I need to do this the way I've been told I need to do this. I need to do all the BTs, the CBTs, the DBTs, the ACTs, the BTs, right? Yeah.
I love it. Yeah.
For me, integration is, I think, partly about resolving and working through this inner conflict in myself, this part of me that's still motivated to adaptation, that wants to be the right kind of therapist, versus the part of me that is just me and just has my basic instincts and my basic sense of what I think is helpful to people, and who understands psychotherapy very, very differently. Yeah, but I think I've been able to do that effectively. I had good support in my practicum. I've had good support from supervisors since then who have validated my interest in the therapy that I'm interested in. And one of the things I want to say is I've really enjoyed integration. I don't know. Your experience has been around that, Richard, but I'm really enjoying making sense of this world. And to me, it's fascinating, and it's awesome to spend a lot of time reading. I spend a lot of time digesting theory. I spend a lot of time reflecting on client experiences and trying to make sense of them. And I have drawn from multiple perspectives. I have begun the process of integration, and it's been excellent. It's been a process of kind of self-discovery, going back to that. I'm really discovering what's true for me. And I'm really finding vehicles and a space for my authentic self to show up in the room with my patients. I'm enjoying and finding meaning in basic psychodynamic perspectives. I feel very inclined towards person-centered psychotherapy still, the existential frame. And just recently, I've really started leaning into experiential technique, which is a little bit new for me, but I feel like I'm at a place now where I'm standing right. Going back to martial arts, I found my footing, Richard. And so now I can kick and it lands, or I can throw a punch and it, it's good. It's good, right? In a way that it wouldn't have been before I found my footing and had a clear sense of how to hold myself in regard to the patient. Yeah, integration has been immensely enjoyable.
Just because it's hard doesn't mean that it can't, or it's a challenge doesn't mean it can't be also.
I think it's enjoyable because it's hard. And that's what makes it meaningful. That's a good way of looking at it. We've touched on several deeper concepts that I think would be worth fleshing out as we wrap up the episode here. You just spent some time, Richard, talking about the importance of self-integration, the integration of one's life world into the theory. We referenced earlier going beyond theoretical integration, personal integration, eschewing theory in some sense in favor of just kind of being who we are. And I think one of the ways that we can encapsulate this is that we've both talked about this idea of really psychotherapy as an art, and that our practice as an artful one, though there's a science, though there's scientific exploration of psychotherapy, and that's immensely helpful and meaningful, that the practice of psychotherapy is ultimately an art form. And that one way we can look at integration, with a big caveat, mind you, is that there's really no right or wrong way to do this. If we take more of that perspective, that psychotherapy, theory integration is important, but it's also about integrating oneself on the personal level and the self level, that we step away then from a realm where it's about this or that perspective or this or that concept or technique. We're in a completely new territory, I think, then, where the stakes are very different and where the work is very different. And I think that as a result of that, getting to that different space, that the ideas of right and wrong that we hold when we think about theory don't make sense anymore.
One thing that I was just thinking was, do we want to talk to the listeners about what are some suggestions that they could become more integrated? Like, do we have some ideas that might help them? Some practical. I was thinking that, what am I saying to the graduate students as they're finishing a program? And they often are asking me, Richard, like, what books do you recommend? What training do you recommend? And absolutely, I share it depending on what thing that they're looking to do. And that is important, ongoing training, ongoing supervision. But I also really, you said it as well, that there can be this idea of like what the right therapy is, or therapy, again, understandably, by the time we're finished grad school, we're very broke. So we're thinking about what therapies are going to be the most accepted kind of in private practice or for an employer. Seem like that will hit the job description. But I talk to them a lot about just the importance of definitely building their support network. So absolutely supervision, peer supervision, but spending time around, that personal integration piece. Maybe it's time, you had a season of grad school of really focusing in a lot of cognitive academic work, but now maybe it's a chance that the learning can happen in different ways. And there's different ways of knowing. So it could be really getting into yoga. It could be joining pickleball. I was talking with a graduate student about this who's really into pickleball. It could be a meditation, meeting lots of different people from different backgrounds, meeting different types of people that are involved in the work of social justice, healing, change. Do we have a cause that we feel deeply connected with? These things, I've definitely evolved in what my recommendations have been beyond here are the 3 books and here are the 3 trainings that I would recommend. Do I share that if people push on that point? Yeah, but that's also a bit tailor-made to the individual. But I'm realizing more and more as I become an old fogey in therapy, not really, but this element of it has to be personal, personal, emotional, spiritual intelligence, whatever we can do to cultivate that seems like an essential foundation for integration of therapy skills and just helping humans get closer to what they're meant to do.
It seems imperative to support people to have a rich inner life, because this is the thing that we're asking our clients to do as well, or at least to engage in some modicum of that, get to know themselves. It feels unfair to ask people to do that if we're not willing to do that ourselves and to stretch the horizons of who we really are in some ways. I think you're right to suggest the value of lived experience of really anything, just trying things, testing oneself, experiencing oneself in a new environment can be revelatory and important. And I think as we grow, we expand our capacity to be with our clients and to be more effective to them. We also have talked about the idea, Richard, of integration as an experiential learning process. I think one of the things that would be helpful for students is to, a couple of things. One, to consider engaging in their own psychotherapy if they're not already doing that, because there's the old adage, you can only take people as far as you've gone. And I think that is patently true in our world, that if you haven't really engaged in a robust journey within yourself, if you haven't really stretched the limits of who you are, or done the inner work to really discover facets of yourself that remain hidden or unconscious, you're not going to be able to do this with other people. It's not going to make sense to you. It's not going to be visible. And so I think that kind of work is important.
Exactly.
But I think also there's just value in, if you're interested in a new type of psychotherapy, it's good to experience it for yourself as a way of learning it.
That's right.
One of the best ways to learn a new therapy is to try it, to experience it, to go through it. I don't believe in doing therapy for therapy's sake. I think therapy needs to be centered on a concrete concern or desire in the person to change. So I'm certainly not recommending listeners just go and, try a therapy for the sake of trying it, because I don't think that's quite the right spirit to engage in therapy. It might be that you're carrying a burden, and maybe it has been that you've tried other ways to put that burden down that you haven't found effective. And maybe there's an opportunity to explore a new or a different way that might carry with it a learning experience that enriches your life professionally as well as personally.
Absolutely. That's the other recommendation that I have that I forgot to mention is, in addition to supervision, and hopefully the graduate student has been receiving counseling, but now that they are maybe started to develop a stance on a particular theory and a particular population and a heart for these things, to immerse themselves in it, because very likely they're resonating with that for a reason. And absolutely it's touching on traumas, adverse experiences and stuff that need to be processed. And that a lot of my focus too with graduate students is going from having that head knowledge to being able to go into the body, help the client notice what's happening in the body, and the therapist noticing what's happening in their body. And you have to go through therapy to really understand what triggers are likely to come up. Let's say you're doing, you're receiving EMDR or internal family system, whatever it is, you're doing that trauma work so that you are going to be less likely to traumatize your client and yourself.
Yeah. You don't really know until you know. You've talked a lot, Richard, about the idea of like almost like encoding in the body, that experiential learning stays in your bones. I'm thinking about this unconscious competence of yours.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think this is really compatible too with the last thing you said here, was with just maybe how we're meant to live as humans in terms of even like indigenous therapy. They wouldn't use the term therapy, but what is happening is highly therapeutic of being in community, of dance, of ritual, of the wisdom of the body. These are critical pieces that I think we have to get to. We lose, there's a danger of therapy becoming too hyper cognitive, hyper rational, and just copying the medical model. We might, as we have tried to, I think, kind of say, the danger of becoming a technician and not a clinician.
Right. I think that is another pitfall in the realm of theory, is that theory is culturally situated and therefore culturally laden and culturally biased. And that, we run the risk while engaging in integration of incorporating the values of our culture over the values of ourselves. And I think the realm of psychotherapy and integration is a rich opportunity to explore that. It's a site where the culture of theory development and the culture of psychotherapy intersects with our own personal values and the person of who we are, the person of the therapist. Well, maybe this is a good place to end the episode for tonight, Richard. Yeah,
it's been a great discussion.
We've given our listeners a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks, Richard.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed the podcast and are a little wiser for it.
Thanks for listening.